comfortable and thankful for many blessings and privileges. And aside from today, where I thought it would be sunny, like I'm usually really loving the spring sunshine. So thank you for being part of the Zoom experiment. Because I think we're all sort of slightly tired and stressed, what I'm going to do is try to mostly clarify a lot of the information that is coming at us about the economic story of COVID-19. And probably like you, I've been reading a lot of think pieces and hot takes and commentary, and there have been some really good ideas out there that I'm going to bring up that I think can help us navigate what feels a lot like chaos. And I'm going to also use ecological economics to help make sense of the different stories we're being told about what we're going through. So first I'm going to talk about what is happening to the economy right now. We're going to talk a bit about the global ecological crisis, how this relates to the worldwide response to the pandemic. And then I'll talk about what are some really interesting social ecological proposals for building a radical new normal or a democratic normal or an alternative. And then I will suggest some actions that we can do right now to bring forth into the future what we're thinking about and seeing in this really uncertain time period, because destabilized times make a lot of things visible to us that were not visible before, as you probably noticed. And we can know the world in a new way right now and know ourselves in new and meaningful ways, even in all of the anxiety and stress. So I am bringing them together a lot of information and clever things that other people have said over the last few weeks. And so I'll be putting up a list of references on the website afterwards. But I just feel like a big thank you for everyone who's been thinking and talking about coronavirus and the economy in the last while, and for sharing their sort of strong thoughts about it. I'm pretty indebted to that for what this talk is sort of hopefully going to be. So now I'm going to share my screen. And yes, share screen. Sorry, I'm not like an expert at this yet. Okay, here we go. So, really quickly, because we might have some new people zooming in who weren't able to make it to the first sessions, I will just say that ecological economics is a field that understands the human economy to be embedded within society and the biosphere of the planet. And this means that to study the economy, we must study social ecological aspects of how we meet our needs and wants as individuals, communities, and members of the global community of life. And the economy is the name for how we acquire, process, and distribute all that we want and need for our lives. So I do want to note that this pandemic times is ongoing. We don't even know where we are yet, if we're in the middle or the end or the beginning of pandemic life changes. And a lot of people have been talking about this pandemic in ways as if it was over already. Like we're preparing for organizing for the recovery and the after times when we don't really know what's going to happen or how it's all going to play out. And for many people like myself who aren't doing the critical work of meeting the public health and survival needs, it does sort of make sense for us to be talking about the future. But I think it is important to stay present in solidarity with essential workers whose lives are not on pause, for our friends and community members, and also for ourselves to pay attention to the difficulties and the stress and the unexpected things that come out of this time period. So we don't know when we are in all this, but we do know where we are, and which is why I called this talk Home is Where We Are, because I will be talking about ecology and economy today, and we are all mostly at home. So oikos is a Greek word that refers to the family, the household, the home, and the activity that took place there. So large households in ancient Greece were often quite self-sufficient. And so thinking about managing a household was about managing a system for the purpose of a good life. Oikos is the root word for the eco in ecology and economics. Eco meaning home, economics is the managing of the household, our home. Ecology is studying our home. So studying our home and the systems and the relationships that interact to support life. So we have been stuck in our homes, told here to stay here for the safety of all of humanity. And a lot of us are looking around at our homes and thinking, okay, how are we going to make this work? Because many of us can't go anywhere else. There are good things and bad things about our homes, and for some people more than others. The safety and comfort of a home of abundance is not an experience shared by everyone. And we are in a pandemic crisis, but we are also have been and continue to be in an ecological crisis. And that ecological crisis is not experienced as in the same way around the world either. So the safe, cozy home certainly feels like a safety net for some these days, but truly one of the many things this pandemic time of social distancing has shown us is that our houses and our apartments and where we sleep is not all that we need. And it is not our home in the fuller sense, because our homes are our communities of people and other beings and the land and the creeks and lakes and the earth. In the past 40 years, but arguably much longer, there's been an ideological push to create a real distinction between private and public spaces, to limit your deep relationship with place to the house or the place that you live in, the land you might own, your domain. Your home is inside and the world outside belongs to the economy, by which I mean the world outside your house is increasingly organized by markets as those public spaces then become privatized. But home itself is a relationship, you might say, to the commons or to the life-giving systems that support us, or to the shared world. We describe home as sweet, where the heart is, even as we are told that our home is only our physical house and our family. I would suggest that our attempts to describe home in this way reveals that home is an experience of relationship, and it is a long-lasting one. It is much more than a combination of a roof and a bed, and to bring that sense of home from out of your house and out of your community, and to start to think of yourself and the things that you do in the world around you as taking care of your home, is to begin to think ecologically, which I know a lot of you already do. So the life-giving systems upon which our well-being relies are in a much broader sense of home, broad in the world. I don't normally like sweet sayings like the one on the right, but on the left, you see NASA's Earth Day poster for this year. And I am pretty on board with the home is where the heart is message in that poster, because it ties, I think, in really well with what I'm saying here. So I just wanted to ground us in thinking about home in a broader sense when we start to talk about the economy or managing our relationship with the earth that is our home. So the economy as it stands today. One thing I keep noticing is the way that these times are being described as an economic story instead of like a public health story. And it is an economic story, just not the way that it's being told, because not everybody means the same thing by economy. An ecological understanding of the economy is to say that it's the way we humans acquire, process, and distribute what we need and want for our lives. When it is in the news, they are definitely talking about the money economy, and they usually mean the stock markets, which are taken as a reflection of the money economy as a whole. And then that being a proxy for the general state of the well-being of the country, which is not accurate. So here are some headlines on the left. If you fill in the way we meet our needs and wants, where they say the economy, they do not make sense. So if you say the way we meet our needs and wants is ruined, or China destroyed our ability to meet our needs and wants, that is just clearly not true, because we are still meeting many of our needs. But if you replace that with markets or stock markets, then it does get closer to the truth. So many are saying that our economy is destroyed, or that we're in a recession, or that we're headed for a depression, or that this is a wartime economy. And none of these are quite correct, because what is happening now has not happened before. And so the old story about economics is not necessarily going to be what works for us. The ways in which we meet our needs has definitely changed. This means the economy has changed very profoundly, because the global health concerns and the public good required us to disengage significantly from the regular market economy, in which wages for work are what is responsible for our incomes. And I know that not everywhere is really picking up the slack in terms of meeting people's needs in an alternative manner. And it is not perfect here in Canada, but there are strong and effective attempts to meet people's needs through other means. In the way that EI has been supplemented here, even though it is not perfect, I realize. And we are also doing a lot of housework and care work. And this is still an economy. It is still taking care of our household. And we still have an economy that is functioning. It is just not a market economy. What governments have done in responding to calls from the WHO is to maintain parts of the economy that are absolutely essential to meeting people's needs, and to shut down what is not essential. What is sort of awful to realize is that these are some of the lowest paid people in all of society, the people who are responsible for the life support of society functioning, health and food. So we should notice that what helps us meet our needs is not what creates profits. Indeed, the stock markets rose very briefly last week when $2.3 trillion in loans, primarily for corporations, were announced. And this was at a time when COVID-19 infections were rising rapidly, when job losses were rising, when lines at the food banks, as you see on the photographs on the right, were shockingly long. And at this time, 10 billionaires made $51 billion in essentially a day. So someone said, and I wish I could remember who it was, but I've seen so many webinars now, someone very brilliant said that in these times, we should think of money like toilet paper, because money is essentially access to resources. So thinking about billionaires hoarding capital as if it were toilet paper might make us a bit more outraged than just thinking about money, especially in the middle of a public health crisis. So the connection between market performance and profit seeking and well-being aren't really as correlated as we have been told. And we should be keeping in mind what the right size and role of markets in our economy, the broad economy of how we meet our needs, is a critical question worth asking. So supply chains. Here's a snapshot that I took, I think yesterday, of global cargo ships moving around. The green ones are cargo. The red ones are oil tankers. I took out all the other craft, but many supply chains are still functioning, and the ones that are stressed out are relatively sort of specific to the medical sector. So things that are related to the health crisis, medical supplies, those are the supply chains that are under pressure right now. The others are still functioning, even though we don't know what will happen in the future. But we never knew what was going to happen in the future. We just thought we did. And there are more than normal ships at sea right now. Normally there's about 168,000, 172 just generally. Right now there's I think 210,000. A few days ago there was 221,000. So there's a lot of stuff moving around, and our stress about the supply of things doesn't have to be perhaps exhausting yet. So in general, Canada exports about 1/3 of what it produces and imports about 1/3. And so about 2/3 of everything that happens is within the boundaries of the country anyways. So the measures that have been taken by governments were intentional to put much of the money and market economy into a pause, but to keep these supply chains going. But a lot of people are talking about a recession. And are we in a recession? The answers are equally no and yes, because a recession is a really technical definition of 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth in the stock markets. And I cannot state this enough, that there shouldn't be growth in the stock markets right now because of how we're responding to the health crisis. So we have not had 2 consecutive quarters of no growth yet, but we likely will, and they will call it a recession, but there isn't anything wrong with that on the surface. If you draw down production at the same rate as consumption, the economy should be fine. Who it is not fine for are investors and banks and billionaires who need the economy as a whole to keep growing always. It is for their perceived financial health that they are freaking out about a recession. It is not for our health. The economy as it is right now is for everyone's health. Normally, recessions mean certain things. They mean higher rates of suicide, they mean people cohabiting more or poorer overall health. But that correlation is not a natural state of the world or what a recession means. What kills people is not lower GDP, it is the way that the lower GDP is distributed. Businesses usually go under and a lot of people lose jobs in a recession. But again, this is not a recession as we usually experiencing them, because this one was caused intentionally in order to create social distancing for overall well-being, long-term well-being. So what we do need to pay attention to, however, is what happens in the aftermath of this, because a lot of think pieces out there are really concerned about how this time period in which our economy in the short term is not one based on market capitalism. So the people who believe in the free market don't want this to inspire people to reimagine how economies could work. And then the people who notice that generally crises are when life-changing regulations come into force, they are worried that this is a particularly vulnerable time for people, the planet, and our well-being. So what could happen? There are so many ideas about what might happen in the next few months and years, but also anyone who says they know what will happen is probably overstepping it a bit. Pardon me. One thing that has been brought up a lot is the environmental impacts of these distancing times. There has definitely been less pollution, less carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, and less depletion of resources. These images that I put up here are from NASA. You may have seen them spreading around. And they're essentially showing a change in what are essentially air pollution. However, all of these environmental effects of lower emissions and pollution won't have made any impact if we go back to the way our global economy functioned. Our worldwide carbon emissions are down by 6% so far this year, which is the biggest drop since World War II. The only time there's ever been absolute decreases in emissions in history is through economic crises in which global production and consumption slow down because of disaster. This is the first time that there has been a massive slowdown in consumption and production because of a collective decision and intervention. However, this 6% decrease would have to be sustained every single year until 2030 for us to meet our 1.5 degrees Celsius targets and our climate targets as set out in the IPCC reports. So one thing to talk about this sort of like downscaling of production and consumption is to say that this is not degrowth. Degrowth has been brought up. We brought it up in the first session on ecological economics because degrowth is part of scaling down the resource and energy use of the global economy to a level that can maintain the social and ecological well-being of the life-giving planetary and social systems. But even though we have reductions in economic activity and emissions right now, this is not degrowth because it has not been part of a democratic participatory design process. And because the downscaling of degrowth needs to be conscientiously long-term. But it does show that it is possible for our economy to be different, that we can change our society in response to a crisis. I know that I have been told for my whole life by people I didn't believe, even though they kept talking, that people can't change, that altruism isn't real, and that society isn't capable of doing things differently. Yet, here we are making changes to the way we live our lives in order to protect everyone in our communities and around the world. Importantly, the degrowth that needs to occur to ensure well-being of people and planet for generations to come is not meant to be in crisis mode. As Peter Victor, a Canadian ecological economist, says, degrowth should be by design, not by disaster. Right now, we are experiencing reduced economic activity, and the social distancing is impacting our well-being, to say nothing of the risks that people who are still working face and the stress that they feel. We are not in a well-being economy right now. Even though there is a drawdown, we are in a public health crisis economy. So thinking about how a drawdown might happen in a socially engaged, participatory manner is what you can be thinking about, perhaps, if degrowth is exciting for you, as it should be, probably. So after the 1918 Spanish flu, there was a period of deglobalization that took place as regions and countries relocalized production of what were deemed to be essential, critical aspects to the survival and well-being of the population. So there are a lot of people predicting this as well now in order to produce essential things. As I showed you before, there are still a lot of supply chains functioning and ships on the seas, but there are also many murmurs of new protectionist rules to create local production and to sort of like protect the boundaries of countries. So this is good and bad, but another subject entirely. The widespread gardening sort of movement that's happening that has been called victory gardens, but has also been suggested to call them decolonization gardens for like part of a longer term project. And they can also, I think, be called home gardens in the broadest sense of home, because they're part of a relocalization process in which lower resource intensity of how we eat, in which we meet some of our needs locally, hyper locally if it's in your own yard, but also because they are a part of a long-term relationship that we have with food production. And also because, as Vandana Shiva likes to say, seeds are a continuity and gardening is being in relationship with continuity. So now I'm going to talk a bit about jobs and the recovery and the energy intensity of these jobs. Because with some relocalization of essential production and the work that will come out of this when we are able to be more physically interconnected, there will be choices to make and possibilities to maybe actually meet our climate targets. There will be support for new jobs, and there will be choices to be had about what kind of broad economy to build. On this slide shows the emissions per job here in Canada. So for every $1 million of output you create in this sector, it takes X amount of jobs and produces X amount of carbon emissions. There's a lot of information here, and if you're very excited about this, we can talk about it at a later time. But on the right-hand column, you will see the ratio of jobs to greenhouse gases as they're ranked highest to lowest. And what this shows is that for each dollar we don't use, for instance, to stimulate the oil and gas sector jobs, and instead support jobs in nursing and residential care facilities, you would get 5 times the number of jobs with 4% of the emissions, which is to say that the proposed deglobalization that might occur and the rebuilding process can certainly be part of getting closer to meeting our carbon reduction targets. But how do we actually make something like more nursing jobs and less oil sector jobs happen? And that is a big question. So the goal of constant GDP growth has long been touted as the same thing as well-being. So governments who sought growth-oriented economic policies appeared to do so for the well-being of the people. There isn't much data that supports this correlation beyond showing that meeting people's basic needs is good for their well-being. And there is a lot of information about well-being and meeting people's needs as the foundation of a just society. It is good to remember here that the people who keep today's economy running for our health and survival are not the same people who benefit from economic growth or from profits. So here's where we have some space to think in this time period about what we think it means to take care of our home and to manage our relationship with the earth and to support well-being. And the very important question to ask is, what should our economy do, and for whom, and for how long? This diagram on the left demonstrates some of the work done in well-being research to establish what our needs are that contribute to our and other people's well-being. It is a pyramid of sorts, which has fundamental needs at the bottom, which are critical. So a well-being economy, sort of the purpose of the whole economy, should be for the long-term well-being of humans and the many beings we share the world with. And right now, the economy as it functions today in social distance mode is organized around the well-being of human beings, all of them. So one of the many proposals that you may have seen in the news is universal basic income. But alongside this is another idea called universal basic services, or a foundational economy, which is a step further, but it can be also quite complementary, and they can sometimes work together. This is an economy that would essentially provide free public transport, free communication services, housing, all of these things on the left here. And importantly, the idea of a foundational economy splits the whole economy into different sections. There's the core economy, which is care work and social reproduction that takes place in the home. There's the foundational or essential part of the economy, which are these things listed on the left. There's the service economy, in which they always list haircuts and tourism, which is too funny, but there's much more there as well. And then there's the market economy, where goods are traded in a competitive market. And in places where this analysis has been done, the foundational or the essential section of the economy represents about 50% of all of the financial economic activity. And this is a pretty radical idea because it changes the mandate of government from providing economic growth to providing sufficient quantity and quality of foundational services. The potential for this to be more democratic is, I think, significant, because imagine if the government was accountable to the people's well-being instead of a bunch of wealthy, mostly men, who run corporations and like economic growth. And while it may sound like it increases state power, all governments support economies in one way or another. The support that governments engage in to make markets work is enormous and is just slightly invisible to many folks who don't pay attention to the markets or to finance. There is a case to be made that universal basic services would actually be a decentralization of governance, because it would shift away from enormous subsidies of the market economy through finance and fossil fuels. For instance, right now, and for the recent past, the fossil fuel subsidies around the world come to about $5 trillion a year. And that number comes from the IMF, and that is a lot of capital. So what UBS might do is diversify the support of the economy that already happens by supporting an economy towards well-being instead of stock market growth. Changing who the economy is for changes who participates in accountability and governance. And I will make some links to this on the website, because there's a lot of interesting people thinking about this right now. So COVID-19 and the climate and the global ecological crisis are similar, because they are, they're just a difference of short and long-term variables. It is hard to act on long-term variables because they seem so distant from us. We have proven that we can all act, and our leaders can act, some of them, in the short term, and that science and modeling are clearly capable of affecting policy when it is urgent to do so. Climate change involves the whole world, has been predicted by science, and we can only address it if we act together. We have known for a really long time that pandemics were coming. We were told to be prepared, and our governments were told to be prepared. Some of them listened better than others. Most didn't super well. We have known for a long time that the terrible effects of climate change are coming if we don't change the way that we live. And we were told to be prepared, and we were told to make changes. we have a chance to learn from how much we didn't prepare for pandemics and how we might take scientists, activists, and people seriously. So the flattening of the curve as a concept is relevant here for climate change as well. So that 1.5 degrees Celsius line, which is sort of the limit of really drastic and terrible climate impacts, that can be considered the sort of like, we can maintain our systems, our Earth systems, the planetary boundary, if we can flatten out the curve over time. And so I've got some key points that I want to leave us with. And one is that when you hear someone talking about the economy, ask yourself if they mean the markets or the broad ways in which we meet our needs. Think about who gets to define what the economy is and what their goals are. Please remember that your well-being does not require economic market growth, and our needs can be met without billionaires becoming more billionary. Real climate action that requires a drawdown of the market economy is possible. You can still have well-being and climate action, but you cannot have climate action and financial market growth, as has been the case in the past. So yes, this means a serious rearrangement of the way we think the world and the global economy and the country works. But please remember that the economy didn't actually meet a lot of our needs before. Even if you are safe and cozy right now, even if you were doing okay before, not everyone's needs were valued or met. And also to listen to yourself in these times, because what you're experiencing and we're all experiencing, and understanding things that are felt with parts of ourselves we don't normally get to listen to. We intellectualize a lot in our world and talk ourselves into and out of feeling things. We can stay with the anxiety of this time period and listen to what it's telling us, especially what the joys are or what the reliefs are. And to remember that the thoughts that you have now and what you're seeing and feeling right now is important and insightful, because you might be tempted to say later on, well, it's over and things are okay again and I'm not stressed out. So maybe that anxiety was in the past, but I don't want you to forget the important things that are happening here. And to also think of home as a relationship with the earth. And then I'm giving you homework, which I've never done before, and you don't have to do it at all, really. But I am imagining a second part to this session in which we come back together in person when we are able to and talk about the rebuilding of a local economy and potentially bringing a well-being economy into our communities and the interesting insights that we have during this time. So I would like you to keep a couple of lists, like actual written down lists, not just running lists in your head. One is to keep track of what is essential for well-being, for yours, your community, and your home, broad sense. And keep a list of all the interactions with people that you notice that you miss, because you might not remember these things. And when the social distancing ends, I hope that we can come together and share these lists. I know that I just showed you a list of sort of the general human needs satisfaction, but getting really clear about what our needs are when we're uncomfortable and shaken from the regular. This will contribute to learn about what is foundation to our well-being specifically in our communities and how we can support each other in continuity. So this is where we are. We are home, but we are part of a larger home, and we can breathe deeply and feel the air in our lungs as the great forests of the earth breathe deeply. It is not a given that we can breathe safely. It is unquantifiable life, and people around the world are struggling to breathe through the effects of COVID-19, and the living systems of our whole earth are also struggling. And taking care of our home is taking care of ourselves and our kin. And so this is just a big thank you, that I have a list of people Yes, there's a lot more people that should be on this list. I will post some references on the website, and my email address is there if you have any more specific questions, or if you want me to send you all those data sets that I had in that one slide. But for now, I will stop sharing so that I can come back and see everyone's face. And we can all see everyone's face. Okay. I think we're back.